Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of MEMO's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my guest, as usual, Mouin Rabbani. Hi, Mouin. Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Nasim. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
So this week we'll be discussing the CNN shocking report from the CNN of abuse and torture in an Israeli detention center, and we'll be diving into that report, looking into details. The resurgence of Hamas in northern Gaza. What does that mean? uh, Growing disagreement between the US and Israel over Rafah. Israeli generals openly disagreeing with Netanyahu and the implications of that. There's also controversy around UN's figures over the death toll in Gaza. So we'll have a conversation about that as well. And Egypt, surprisingly, has decided to join South Africa's genocide case against Israel. Um, what's the thinking behind that? And last two topics we will be discussing, myself and Moin, is the UN General Assembly voting to include Palestine as one of its members, and also President Biden commenting last week that Hamas is motivated by ancient hatreds. And I thought that was such a shocking statement to make. It was met with a lot of criticism. I want to get Moin's thoughts on that as well. But as I said, Moin, let's begin with the CNN report, which exposed shocking abuse of torture of Palestinians at a military base and a detention center. There were reports of Palestinians whose hands were chopped off because their wrist was tied with handcuffs. So it's quite horrific details. But I want to ask you, what did you make of the fact that it was CNN who produced this report, given CNN is usually seen as a quite a pro-Israeli outlet, and also the details of the report itself? What stood out for you?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, it was a shocking report. And I think for many people, just as shocking is that the report was released by CNN rather than, for example, Al Jazeera. And I think the reason for that is that the story was primarily based on the accounts of Israeli whistleblowers, and particularly Israeli medics who worked in this camp and revealed their experiences to CNN. So that, I think, for CNN made it kosher. They had sources that, according to their criteria, were reliable rather than being dirty Arabs or Palestinians or anything like that. So that was one aspect of it. The other one is that the details revealed, uh, detainees having their hands and arms zip tied for so long with no further blood flow that apparently developed gangrene and had to have their hands amputated. But most shocking was the account of one whistleblower who described this camp as a paradise for medical interns because they were able to conduct all these medical procedures for which they were absolutely not qualified on medical prisoners. I mean, it's a bit like Camp Yosef Mengele, you have medics who were not qualified, who were using these living Palestinians to learn skills the way that normally you would use, let's say, either corpses or laboratory animals. And apparently this prison also functioned as something of a medical school. And other whistleblowers told of experiences where they were told to perform specific medical procedures. They indicated they were not qualified to do them, and then were told to do them anyway. And again, this is just what we've learned from the small number of whistleblowers who spoke to CNN. So it's quite clear that once the real story gets out, all the other details that either were not revealed to CNN or that CNN, for whatever reason, did not divulge, it's going to be very, very much worse than what we've already learned.
Yes, and the next big story that came out of Gaza last week is the launch of Israeli military operations in a number of areas in northern Gaza. And it seems to be that the Israeli troops are bogged down there, and there seems to be a insurgency against Israeli occupation in the Gaza Strip. And of course, that begs the question, where is the victory and the clearing of Hamas from northern Gaza, which Israel has proclaimed, many months ago? So what do you make of the fact that northern Gaza is now in the midst of an Hamas insurgency against Israeli occupation forces, and Israel is bogged down in northern Gaza once again?
Well, I think you have to look at how Israel has been presenting its campaign. At the beginning of last week, it was claiming that Hamas had, I believe, 24 battalions on October 7th, that it has eliminated 20 of them from northern and central Gaza and from the Khan Yunis district, and that there were only these 4 battalions left in Rafah, and that once it eliminated those, the war would essentially be over, resulting in a complete victory for the Israeli military. But no sooner did Israeli military operations in the Rafah region begin than you began to see a significant insurgency in northern Gaza, particularly in Jabaliya refugee camp, Jabaliya town, and in certain districts of Gaza City, particularly the Zaytun neighborhood. And this demonstrates only one of two things. Either that Hamas has effectively been able to reconstitute its forces in these areas after the Israelis withdrew from them, or that they were never dismantled to begin with, which I think is a more likely scenario. The more likely scenario is that as any force engaging in combat, they were weakened. But as soon as they had the opportunity, they began to reconstitute themselves. They've now been, again, firing missiles from launchers that were supposedly all eliminated, using weapons that have supposedly all been removed, and using tunnels that were supposedly all destroyed. And what this demonstrates, I think, is that Hamas and the other armed groups in Gaza have much more staying power than Israel assumed they do, and that every time the Israelis withdraw from an area, they very quickly reconstitute themselves, assuming that they were ever in disarray to begin with. And this, of course, I think is also intended by Hamas to send a very clear message about Rafah. If you think that you're going to solve your problem by going into Rafah and taking on the 4 battalions there, that's just going to take you back to the beginning of this all, because we're now back in the north, we're back in the center, and we're back in Khan Yunis.
And do you think that's also having an effect in the way the US is viewing this? It seems to be a lack of faith in Israel's ability, first of all, to go into Rafah and do what it says it will do, partly because it looks at northern Gaza and sees there are Hamas who have reconstituted, as you said. So why would they trust the Israelis to go into Rafah and do what it's done? Which is probably why there's been a major criticism from, well, not major, but pushback from the US, who say they are not going to support any major offensive in Gaza. Is that how you see US criticism of the Rafah offensive, and the fact that it is probably an indication of a lack of faith and confidence in Israel being able to do what it claims to be able to do?
Yes and no. I mean, I can't imagine that serious American military professionals have not lost faith in the ability of their Israeli counterparts. I mean, 8 months taking on a second-order militia in a postage-sized stamp territory, using every conceivable weapon at their disposal and being able to use them with abandon because there is full-scale impunity and no accountability. And yet, these groups are now emerging back as a serious fighting force in those very areas Israel claims to have defeated and dismantled. But having said that, I think Rafah is also a separate issue in the sense that early on, the Israelis began ordering hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians, mainly from northern Gaza, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, Gaza City, and some of the refugee camps, Nusayrat, Brej and Maghazi in the central Gaza Strip, to seek safe haven in the south, mainly in the Rafah area. And now they want to go into Rafah. And the US would rather not be complicit in this. But here again, one thing you always learn about the Americans is trust what they do, not what they say. So in this particular case, the Americans have repeatedly, openly, publicly expressed their objection to an Israeli attack on Rafah that did not include a comprehensive and credible plan to ensure the safety of those million-plus civilians who were there. Biden, in a press interview on CNN, indicated that he would withhold 2,000-pound bombs from the Israeli army, that he would postpone their delivery if they were going to be used in Rafah. But then one spokesperson after the other was trotted out, basically to say this is not a major offensive. All our weapons, with this one exception, are still being delivered. So it turned out to be another meaningless charade. And it wouldn't surprise me to learn that some of these weapons are now actually being used in Jabaliya, for example, or in the Zaytun area. I mean, what's the point of saying you can't use this particular weapon in one very densely populated area, but we have no problem with you using it in any other densely populated area? It just shows that when push comes to shove, the US is systematically unprepared to cross the Rubicon and call Israel to account, to impose significant consequences upon Israel for its conduct, and to remove the safety net of impunity that it has offered to the Israelis since October 7th.
Yeah, and the cracks which you mentioned, I mean, they're not, of course, deep cracks. Ultimately, if Israel was to insist, most likely the Americans would cave in, and any demand, I mean, any red line will always be crossed, and it's very unlikely the US will enforce its red lines, and that's been the case throughout. But there are also cracks within the Israelis themselves. Last week, Israeli generals openly briefed against Benjamin Netanyahu, and that seems to me a new development, showing that faith and confidence in Israel achieving its war objective is decreasing week by week. And generals disagreeing with politicians is never usually a good sign. And we saw that in many conflicts. The Iraq War, for example, politicians wanted to invade Iraq in 2003, whereas the generals didn't. They thought that this was really a distraction, and it wasn't. There was no connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So it was all really a project that was not grounded on any facts. And it seems, more and more Israeli generals are realizing, we've basically began a campaign which doesn't have an end goal, which seems more about vengeance and destruction. What is the political outcome here? And they seem to be questioning their politicians on this regard. So is there another crack which you also see that will have major implications in the coming weeks?
Very much so. I mean, there's essentially two wars going on. One is Israel's war against the Gaza Strip, and the other is a war of all against all within the Israeli political and military establishment. So you've got the generals now leaking against Prime Minister Netanyahu. You have Defense Minister Gallant, who hopes to replace Netanyahu as head of the Likud. You have Benny Gantz and Ghazi Eisenkot, who hoped themselves to replace the Likud altogether. And so, on the one hand, they're prosecuting this war. On the other hand, they're all constantly maneuvering against each other. But with respect to the specific issue you raised, I think what it all comes down to is that one typically wages war to achieve a political objective. And Netanyahu has thus far refused to announce a clear political objective that Israel is trying to achieve beyond destroying Hamas, reducing its governing, um, uh, uh, removing its ability to rule the Gaza Strip, more recently retrieving the captives and hostages from the Gaza Strip. But in terms of what the political future of the Gaza Strip is supposed to be, he has said nothing. And the reasons for this are multiple. On the one hand, he has people even to even more extreme right than he is, the Kahanists like Ben Gvir and the party led by Smotrich, without which his coalition cannot survive, basically would collapse his coalition if he were to put forward any political alternative for Gaza that has any role for the Palestinians. And on the other hand, he's under pressure from the Americans and some in the security establishment who see this war as an opportunity to bring the Palestinian Authority back into the Gaza Strip on the back of Israeli tanks. And I think it's also in the context of what we were just discussing about the northern Gaza Strip, which is you withdraw from an area, you don't even attempt to put in place any alternative to Hamas, and then lo and behold, Hamas is ruling the roost again. And I think the generals are expressing their frustration of this is just going to be ad infinitum unless and until the Israeli government puts forward a clear political objective and at least attempts to implement it. The military will just continually be throwing good money after bad without achieving any military or political objective.
Yeah, so the next question I want to ask you about is another propaganda story. The Israelis have been telling the world how they have achieved victory, and they've presented a nice, neat propaganda narrative about destroying Hamas, and we see that that's totally collapsed, given how northern Gaza is now, contested over with Hamas. But this one is to do with the numbers itself. This week, the UN reported two sets of numbers, one on May 8 and one on May 6, and there was slight discrepancy between the two numbers. And the usual naysayers have, jumped onto that and said that this is further proof that the civilian casualties that have been cited was nothing but Hamas propaganda. And many pro-Israeli outlets have been pushing this narrative over the past few days. The numbers are slightly different, but not the actual death toll itself. Death toll is still around 35,000, but the civilian casualties and the number of women that were killed is slightly different. So how do you explain the slight variation in the UN numbers here?
Well, actually, these are not UN numbers. These are two sets of figures coming from Gaza. You have the figures that are being presented by the government media office in the Gaza Strip on the basis which states that something like 70% of those killed in this conflict have been either women or children. And then you have a separate set of figures from the Ministry of Health in Gaza, which divides the casualties into men, women, children, and the elderly. And according to those figures, women, children, and the elderly account for some 60% of those killed. So the total number is absolutely the same. There's a discrepancy here between reported figures and identified figures. In other words, identified dead are those who have been identified by name and identification number and so on. And I think what this demonstrates is that the Gaza Ministry of Health is exactly as professional and scrupulous as every independent analyst who has looked at its figures has been concluding for many years. Otherwise, there would be no discrepancy between the Ministry of Health and the government media office. And I think for my purposes, I think the Ministry of Health's figures would be more reliable than those issued by the government media office, which probably relies much more on reporting rather than precise identification of individuals. So this whole story is a bit of a storm in a teacup. Genocide denialists are having a field day with it. The good news is that according to the Ministry of Health's figures, the total number of children killed is actually a few thousand less than reported by the government media office. So those are really the issues here. But then what the genocide denialists are claiming is that actually the number of civilian casualties is only half that was previously reported. Well, first of all, that's not true. If you assume that every dead male was a fighter and every dead woman, child, and senior citizen was a civilian, then the percentage of civilian casualties is already 60%. My colleague at Jabaliya, Maya Mekdashi, already in 2014, wrote a wonderful article about can Palestinian men be victims too? And I think if one assumes that a very good percentage of Palestinian men who have been killed are either not members of Hamas or not engaged in fighting, then the percentage of civilians is already at 70%. And we haven't even gotten into issues like the 10,000 plus corpses buried under the rubble who are not included in any of these figures. Those who are in mass graves who have not yet been either reported or identified. Or another issue that has received insufficient attention is that despite its professionalism, we have to take into account the Ministry of Health's reduced capacity given the circumstances, and that the figures may in fact be significantly higher than they have been able to report, but that they are not reporting because something that is not properly reported and properly identified doesn't make it into their statistics.
Yes, and I've always had slight discomfort in the fact that there's an assumption in constantly saying that the number of people that are killed are mainly women and children, but forgetting the fact that most of the men are most likely non-Hamas, are not Hamas fighters as well. So I think when people repeat those numbers, they don't seem to qualify properly. And the only qualification is that, most are women and children, but also most of the men are most likely not Hamas fighters as well. So there's an assumption which that needs to be clarified. I want to turn our attention to Egypt now. And Egypt has done something which I think has surprised many, which is that it's joined the South African legal case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. I was surprised by that. You were probably too. I know many have been. How seriously should we take Egypt's threat or claim to join the South African ICJ case? And is this really Egypt trying to squeeze some kind of political advantage from the Israelis and the Americans, given how uncertain the future is and what kind of pressure Americans and the Israelis will apply on Cairo?
Yeah, it's an interesting development, and I think it's very much related, first and foremost, to Israel's seizure of the border crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, which the Egyptians see as being a violation of all kinds of bilateral and multilateral agreements that were made between 1979 and 2005. And, the Israelis parading around with a massive Israeli flag on the border. clearly would not have made the Egyptians any happier about it. Now, the Egyptians are concerned about a number of things. First of all is those specific issues. Second of all is this puts the Egyptian government very much in the spotlight because it shows them once again to be doing absolutely nothing to support the Palestinians. And that is going to be a factor for Egyptian public opinion. And so this measure of joining the South African case against Israel at the International Court of Justice is, I think, also a signal. It's a signal not only to Israel of watch your step, but also, I think, a signal to Egyptian public opinion of we haven't abandoned the Palestinians quite as badly as you think. And I think another factor, and this is speculation, is that there is probably quite a bit of discomfort within senior ranks of the Egyptian security establishment about the Sisi government being too lenient towards Israel in this war. They don't want to see chaos on their border in the Gaza Strip because of its national security implications. For example, for a resurgent insurgency in the Sinai. They don't want to see what ramifications this could have for domestic stability in Egypt. And therefore, I think this should be primarily seen as an effort by the Egyptian government to mollify various actual or potential critics. If it's going to be enough, as the Israelis continue to plow their way through another mound of Palestinian corpses in Rafah, we'll have to see.
Yeah, and one of the big stories on the international scene is the UN General Assembly voting to back a Palestinian bid for membership. The Assembly voted 143 to allow Palestinian, but I think 143 to 25, 9 against, sorry, and 25 abstentions.
Abstentions, yes.
Yeah, abstentions.
And had, a few more meters of sea level rise, and it would have been 143 to 3. So
yeah, yeah. Joke aside, I mean, there's a number of points to be made here. Of course, the important point is one of the things is what is the point of all this, given that Palestine is now one state. Israel occupies every inch of Palestine from the river to the sea, and many will say, isn't it too little, too late? Should Palestinians still be striving for a two-state scenario? And the other interesting thing I noted was how the resolution was crafted to avoid any penalty backlash from the United States, sorry, because there's a 1990 US law that bans funding of any UN agency which accords the PLO the same standing as a member state. So I found that interesting. And also the fact that a number of US politicians, Congress members, are now demanding that the US use that very 1990 law to, cut funding from the United Nations. So just your response to that, and also the fact that, going forward, what do you say to a lot of the one-staters who think that two-state has gone, that ship has sank, and what is the point of having a UN membership for Palestine?
Well, I think this is less about the one state, two state debate, and this is more about enhanced international, in fact, global recognition of the Palestinians as a people with inalienable rights. What this resolution does is it gives the Palestinian delegation to the United States, to the United Nations, enhanced rights and responsibilities, short of full membership, because it still can't, for example, vote or be represented in particular bodies. But I think its main value is that it demonstrates once again how thoroughly isolated Israel's chief sponsor, the United States, is on the world stage. Even its closest ally, the United Kingdom, abstained on this resolution. Even Germany abstained on this resolution, but for the United States, Israeli extremism is sacrosanct. And regarding this, there were 25 abstentions, 9 votes against. I think the Czech Republic and the Hungarians and a few sinking South Pacific islands. And again, it not only demonstrates U.S. isolation, but the radicalism with which the U.S. embraces these positions and its rejection of any Palestinian rights or membership in any international body, I think is also serving to make the U.S. a bit of an international laughingstock. Now, regarding this U.S. legislation that you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, this is a congressional act that requires the United States to withdraw from membership and cut off funding to any international body that accepts Palestine as a member. What I think the Palestinians should do is go for those organizations that the U.S. holds most near and dear, like the International Patent Organization or whatever it's called, where the U.S. has a real stake. If they want to sacrifice that for the sake of Israel, well, let them. One last point about this General Assembly resolution. Of course, a state cannot become a UN member unless it has a recommendation to do so from the Security Council. And it's the United States that is holding it up in the Security Council since 2011 and most recently last month. And so this General Assembly resolution also called upon the Security Council to reconsider this matter once again, which of course it won't do. So yes, you can have a discussion about one state versus two state and all the rest of it. But I think the real value of such initiatives is to demonstrate once again how out of touch the United States is, how opposed the United States is to the will of the international community.
Sticking with the US, I mean, I think the last bit of our conversation will be on the US on two specific issues. First is, you mentioned the radicalism of the US. Is that radicalism also shown by the way judged Israeli actions in Gaza? The State Department reported that, concluded that Israel had not violated international law or US law in Gaza in the way it prosecuted its military operation since 7 October. But it was highly critical of Israel. And I think many people were taken back by that. No, not taken back. I would say I was slightly surprised. They could have been a bit more critical, given the whole world sees Israel committing at least human rights violation, if not genocide. And for the US to come out and say that Israel's not violating any international or US law, it just seems extremely radical, as you pointed out, extremely isolated, extremely minority view. What was your thoughts in the assessment of Blinken when it came to the US report on Israel's prosecution of the war?
It was actually worse than that. I mean, if the US had simply come out and said, we looked into this matter, Israel is indeed the most moral army in the universe, and we haven't seen any violations of international law, and therefore we will continue supplying them with our weapons, that would have been bad enough. But the US, once again, couldn't resist going one step further and making a fool out of itself by saying that on the one hand, it believes that Israeli actions have not been consistent with international law, but on the other hand, that it considers Israeli assurances that its military is operating consistent with international law to be both credible and reliable. And on top of that, that the US, with all its satellites and intelligence capabilities has been unable to determine whether US weapons have been implicated in any of these violations of international law. So, I mean, it's a bit the worst of both. On the one hand, the US is unable to give Israel a clean bill of health, but at the same time, it believes that it's impossible to get enough information to take any actions or to attach any consequences for what it believes to be the case. I mean, it makes the U.S. look less informed than any of the NGOs it relies upon. It makes the U.S. look like a thoroughly incompetent intelligence apparatus. It's again, if the U.S. had simply said, there's nothing wrong here, people would have held the U.S. in contempt. But by trying to have it both ways, people are holding the U.S. not only in contempt, but the U.S. has also once again succeeded in transforming itself into a global laughingstock.
And it was Biden at least turned himself into some form of a global laughingstock when he again showed his ignorance by suggesting that the Hamas and Palestinians are motivated by ancient hatreds for Jews. And that was a statement he made during his speech at the Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony. And when I heard that, I was thinking, what ancient hatred of Jews is he talking about? Of course, there was ancient hatred of Jews in Europe, which you can say led to the Holocaust. But that's not something you can pin on Hamas and the Palestinians. You don't require to harbor ancient hatreds to want to resist a foreign occupation. So again, Biden seems to be completely misinformed, and to use that term, ancient hatred for Jews, is what's motivating Hamas. It was criticized, but I thought it was really uncalled for. And for someone like Biden to utter those words, someone should have taken him aside, checked his speech and said, look, take this out. This is not historically correct. It's completely inaccurate. And you're giving a complete misrepresentation of history of Jews in the Middle East.
Well, those who you say should have advised him to take that portion of his speech out are probably the people who insisted he include it. Why? Because it fits the propaganda narrative that what we're seeing in Gaza today is really an extension of what we saw in Europe over many centuries, culminating in the Holocaust between 1940 and 1945. In other words, it's not Israel colonizing the Palestinians. This is not an issue of the US fully complicit with Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians. No, this is a case of Jews resisting the ancient persecution and persecution of them by Europeans and now Hamas. So Hamas are essentially 21st century Nazis. And that fits the propaganda narrative. And that helps, I think, Americans and others rationalize their complicity and implication and support of Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people. And again, ancient hatreds. Well, Hamas does not have a record of attacking Jews who were not Israeli, of targeting Jews who were not Israeli, rather, does not have a record of targeting either Jews or Israelis outside of Israel, Palestine. But, from Biden's worldview, what we're seeing now, all this nonsense about October 7th, didn't take place in the context of the question of Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it was the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, as if that's the prism through which we should understand what is happening in the Middle East and specifically in Gaza, rather than looking at it through the prism of Israel's dispossession of the Palestinian people over the past 75 plus years.
Thank you, Mouin. That wraps up another episode of MEMO's weekly review show with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. And thank you for tuning in, and see you next week for another episode of the MEMO review. Bye-bye.